Your dog needs to get out of this neighborhood right now. Priscilla Harroway, the HOA president in a blindingly bright suit, screamed in the middle of the park, then sprayed mace directly into the face of Orion, my gentle service dog. But what she didn't know was that her action was a federal crime, and just minutes later, the police had her in handcuffs in front of the entire community. This wasn't just about a dog, it was the raw truth. Those who abuse power and discriminate eventually face consequences. I used to think the rest of my life would pass by quietly, after years bound to the battlefield and wounds that never truly healed. War didn't just take my health, it robbed me of the ability to sleep soundly each night. The explosion, the gunfire, the screams of comrades are lodged in my memory, as if they happened just yesterday. I left the military with a limp in my legs and eyes. It grew dimmer with the years, the result of shrapnel still buried deep in chronic pain that no one but me could ever understand. But in all that ruin, I was not entirely alone. Beside me was always Orion, the service dog specially trained to accompany veterans like me. He wasn't a pet, wasn't something ornamental, but a fellow soldier, the only companion who could feel the unsteadiness in every one of my steps. Orion didn't just keep me upright, he pulled me out of the endless nightmares, the sweat-drenched dreams where I still thrashed like I was stuck in the trenches. I once tried living in the city, a place where people were too busy to notice someone like me. But the crowds, the blaring car horn, the flickering lights made it hard to breathe. In the end, I chose to leave. I needed somewhere quiet, where the nights brought only the sound of insects, with no alarms or screaming voices. And so I bought a small house in Lakeshore Heights, a lakeside neighborhood advertised as a retreat paradise, with a friendly community and clean environment. I didn't expect much, just a solid roof and a trail to walk with Orion every morning. On the first day there, I took Orion for a walk around the lake, my heart both nervous and alert, as if stepping into a new war zone. I took a deep breath, tasting the clean water in the air and the scent of pinewood from the towering trees. The birdsong high in the canopy made me pause for a moment. It was a sound too foreign to me, so peaceful it felt unreal. Children were laughing in the distance, their clear voices echoing with a strange familiarity that tugged at something buried deep in my path. I stood by the lake, sunlight glinting off the rippling surface, clouds drifting in reflection. I told myself, maybe this will be a new beginning. Maybe I've finally found a place where my soul can rest. But that maybe was extinguished almost as soon as it sparked. On the white gravel path looping around the lake, a woman appeared. Even from afar, I could feel her presence. Each rigid step of hers struck the ground sharply, her heels clicking like she was on parade, as if the entire path belonged to her. And then she came into view, Priscilla Harroway, a name I had read once, on the neighborhood bulletin board, next to the title of HOA president in bold capital letters, along with a wall of rigid rules and notices plastered all over the board near the front gate. Priscilla wore a light-colored suit, tightly fitted, as if to prove she had control over everything, her body and the world around her. Sunlight hit the fabric and reflected a kind of artificial shine, while her face was stone-like, void of even a single wrinkle of warmth. But the most terrifying thing was her eye, cold, sharp, and full of judgment. She stopped, stared directly at Orion, then curled her lips, not in a greeting, but in pure, undisguised contempt. "That dog makes the whole neighborhood look bad." The words weren't loud, but they cut like a knife. Froze, the leash stiff in my hand. Orion kept walking calmly, unaware of what was happening, his tail gently wagging like any other day, his eyes looking up at me with trust. He had no idea he'd just been labeled a blemish on the community image. I didn't know what made Priscilla say that. Was it because Orion wasn't a fancy breed, or was it because of me, with my limp and worn face, that she couldn't stand the sight of us? I had faced enemies with guns, had run across battlefields scattered with the bodies of my fellow soldiers, but it was this casual kind of disdain, Priscilla's, that sent a chill down my spine. Maybe because it didn't come from fear, from blind belief in her own authority, a kind of power not rooted in justice, but in the chair she sat in the web of rules she had drawn up, forced on every resident, without needing a valid reason. My first instinct was to shout back, to ask if she even knew what a service dog was, if she had ever read the federal laws that protect these animals. Parted my lips, ready to speak, but then I stopped. Years in the military taught me when to stay silent. The more you react, the more reason you give someone like her to escalate. I clenched my jaw, swallowed the surge of anger, and told myself that silence, at this moment, was the smarter choice, even if it burned going down. Orion's ears lowered slightly. Maybe he sensed the tension in my body. I placed a hand on his head, gave him a gentle stroke to reassure him and to keep myself from snapping. I'd endured worse than this, but I still couldn't get used to being looked down on without reason. After a few heavy seconds, I gave Orion a nod. We turned and continued walking forward. Behind me, Priscilla's gaze hung like a mid-air blade, not piercing straight through, but deep enough to leave a mark. My first morning in Lakeshore Heights had already become a clear warning. The peace I was searching for did not live here. Behind that quiet lake and the sound of birdsong was a silent, ruthless hierarchy, ready to cast out anyone who didn't fit the mold they built. And the one holding the scale for that mold was Priscilla Harroway, a self-crowned queen of the neighborhood, someone who didn't need to shout to make others feel unwelcome. I had hoped Lakeshore Heights would be a place of healing, but now I understand that I've stepped into a different kind of battle. There are no bullet, no grenade, but there are things far more insidious and unpredictable: discrimination, control, and the abuse of power under the guise of preserving standards. And I, who once fought for a country, now have to fight again, not for glory, but to protect my dignity and the only loyal companion I have, Orion. The next morning, I decided to take Orion to the community park for our usual training. The brick-paved path leading to the park stretched past rows of homes with intricately decorated porches and lawns trimmed so precisely it felt like the place existed more to display wealth than for people to actually enjoy. Orion walked steadily beside me, his tail gently swaying, his eyes bright and I thought that maybe, despite the blatant contempt from Priscilla Harroway the day before, today would be quieter. But that thought shattered the moment we reached the park entrance. Priscilla was standing there, her posture stiff like a statue, her light-colored suit stark against the cool green of the tree. She wasn't there to stroll, had brought no one along, only her cold gaze fixed tightly on me and Orion. As I approached, Priscilla took half a step forward, blocking the path, her heel striking the ground like a warning. "Dogs are banned here. Didn't you read the rules?" Her voice rang out sharp and deliberate, loud enough for everyone on the nearby benches to hear. I noticed a few glances in our direction, some uneasy, some quietly watching, as if waiting for a show. I took a deep breath, stayed calm, and replied clearly, "Orion is a service dog, protected under federal law." I spoke slowly, each word emphasized to make it clear this wasn't a request or a mistake, but a right guaranteed by law. Orion sat calmly beside me, his posture composed, his eyes patient, a living testament to the legitimacy of his presence. Priscilla stared at me, her eyes cold and disdainful, a half-smile twisted onto her face, heavy with mockery. "Here, I am the law. The federal government has nothing to do with Lakeshore Heights." Her voice dragged the words out, like she was making sure each one landed as an insult. I heard the murmurs behind me. A middle-aged man leaned toward his wife, whispering something, and the two of them stared at me, as if measuring how I would respond. I could feel the tension thickening, the air no longer the fresh morning breeze by the lake, but the stale pressure of a courtroom where I stood as the accused and Priscilla had crowned herself judge. I looked her directly in the eye, without flinching. "You may stand above the residents here, but you do not stand above the law." My voice was low but firm. I didn't want to yell people like, fed on the satisfaction of watching others lose control, but I also refused to let silence become submission. Priscilla burst out laughing, a shrill sound that echoed through the park, making a few people lift their heads from their newspapers. "The law? Don't bring that nonsense here. This community is mine. If someone fits in, I let them stay. If they don't, I make sure they leave." She pressed hard on the words, "make sure they leave," turning them into a public threat. I felt Orion shift slightly, his ears perking up as if picking up the tension in her voice. I bent down, placed my hand on his head, partly to reassure him, partly to stop myself from spitting out the curses I was swallowing back. The people around us kept watching, some eyes showing confusion, but no one stepped forward to speak against her arrogance. Their silence felt like complicity, or at least fear of the authority Priscilla had draped over herself. My mind flashed back to the battlefield, where the weak crushed unless someone dared to stand up. And here, the scene was no different, a community living under the shadow of a self-imposed tyrant, choosing silence to avoid becoming the next target. "You think a sick dog like that adds value to this neighborhood?" Priscilla suddenly lowered her voice, but just enough for me to hear, her finger pointing straight at Orion. That sentence cut across my chest like a blade. She wasn't just insulting Orion, she was insulting me, and every veteran who had come back with a body less whole. I tightened my grip on the leash, looked her straight in the eye, and this time I didn't hold my voice. "This dog has saved my life more than once. And you, what have you ever done besides tearing others down to lift yourself up?" The words came out sharp and clean, enough to make a few people nearby nod slightly. I saw an elderly man smile quietly, his eyes flickering with agreement, though he didn't dare say a word. Priscilla froze for a moment, then her face shifted, her eyes flaring. "Watch yourself. You have no idea what I'm capable of." She spun on her heel and walked off, the sound of her heels on the brick path dragging behind her like an extended threat. I stood there, my breath heavy, while Orion gently nudged his head against my leg. He didn't know everything that had just happened, but he understood how I felt. I knelt down, patted his neck soft, and whispered, "We're not backing down." That morning, I realized Priscilla's contempt wasn't just for me, it was for anyone who didn't fit into her definition of worthy. I didn't need anyone to explain it further. Her attitude had already made it plain. A person using the HOA as a tool for discrimination, arrogance, and control. And I knew this wasn't the end of it. It wouldn't stop at one public insult. It would continue, and it would get worse. But in that moment, with my hand resting on Orion's head and his eyes steady with unwavering trust, I reminded myself that I had survived a war. I hadn't come here to bow to a petty tyrant in an HOA suit. I came here to protect the rare peace I had left in life, and if someone tried to take that from me, I would fight to the end. Orion sat close beside me, posture straight, ears alert, eyes clear, as if untouched by the hatred being hurled his way. He was born to serve, to protect, to walk alongside people like me, those who returned from war with bodies no longer whole. To me, Orion was a witness to sleepless night, a steady hand when I was drowning in brutal memory. And yet Priscilla had the gall to speak, her voice thick with venom. This dog pollutes the very air around here. I stood frozen for a few seconds, thinking I had misheard, but her eyes burned with contempt, and her words landed like a blade straight through my chest. Around us, people paused, some walking their children, others holding hot coffee. Everyone halted. I saw hesitant eyes, some shocked, others gleaming with a cruel curiosity, like they were about to watch a show that wouldn't cost them anything. Before I could react, Priscilla suddenly reached into her handbag and pulled out a can of mace. Everything happened so fast, I barely had time to breathe. She raised her arm, pressed the trigger, and sprayed it directly into Orion's. The hiss of the spray was short but searing, like metal scraping across raw skin. Orion recoiled sharply, his eyes tearing up, sniffling, struggling to look up at me. My heart tore open. I had seen comrades fall on the battlefield, but I had never witnessed anything so cruel and petty. I shouted, my voice tearing through the air. You just committed a federal crime. My words rang through the small square horse, trembling, full of fury. I wanted the entire neighborhood to hear, to understand that what they had just seen was no longer personal. It was a crime carved into law. Priscilla remained unfazed. She shrugged, her lips curling into a smug smile. Crime? I define crime around here. Her voice poured out cold and sharp, saturated with false authority. And the terrifying part was that a few people nearby nodded instinctively, as if they had long accepted her version of reality. Whispers. That's awful. A woman pulled her young son back, eyes wide with fear. An old man sighed, shook his head, then buried his face back in his newspaper as if hiding. They saw. They knew it was wrong. But their silence, that silence was exactly what had allowed Priscilla to behave like a tyrant for all these years. I knelt down and held Orion, my heart burning. He trembled, trying to press his face into my hand, as if to tell me he was okay. But I could see clearly his eyes were red, tears streaming from the corners, and the pain made his breathing short and sharp. I held him tightly against my chest, feeling his rapid heart, and in that moment, something inside me ignited. This was no longer personal, no longer just an insult aimed at me. It was an insult to the entire legal system, to the dignity of those who are vulnerable. I looked up, locking eyes with Priscilla. She still stood there, the can of mace in her hand, her eyes glowing with satisfaction. That image seared into my mind, turning into a vow that I would not let her walk away from this. I had come here hoping for peace, but now I knew with absolute clarity, a new war had just begun, and this time, the enemy was a woman wearing the false armor of HOA authority. Around us, the murmurs kept spreading, each one rippling outward. She's out of her mind. That's basically animal abuse. It's a service dog. Isn't there a law about that? But none of it moved beyond whispers. No one stepped forward. This collective cowardice reminded me of the days when new recruits watched their fellow soldiers get mistreated by corrupt superiors, knowing it was wrong, but staying silent to protect themselves. I wasn't in the military anymore, but the old lesson hit hard again. If one person doesn't speak up, cruelty will spread unchecked. I looked around and saw a few phones raised. Some people were quietly recording, their hands shaking but their eyes flashing with anger. Maybe they didn't have the courage to confront Priscilla direct, but they knew that what they captured today could become a lethal blow later. I gave a slight nod, fragile hope rising in me. Orion lifted himself up and gently licked my hand. I felt my throat tighten, the pain inside me sharpening into resolve. I wasn't just a veteran looking for a quiet life. I was the one who would stand against this cruelty. I stood up, holding Orion firmly in my arms, Priscilla straight in the eye, and said each word with clarity. This day won't end the way you think it will. She curled her lips, waved her hand dismissively, and turned to walk away, her heels pounding the pavement like a drumbeat meant to intimidate. But I knew each step she took was the beginning of a downfall she never saw coming. I left the park holding Orion, feeling the tremble in his body slowly fade in my arm. The fire in me burned hotter than ever. Priscilla thought she could redefine crime on her own terms, but what she had just ignited was a battle far beyond her control. That day, I returned home, filled with fury, but seeing things more clearly than ever. This would be the turning point, the spark. I had seen injustice in uniform, had survived far worse, and I knew one thing for certain: whoever dares to harm Orion, and in doing so, insult the dignity of humanity itself, will not escape the hand of justice. If you saw someone spraying mace into a service dog's face in the middle of your neighborhood, how would you react? Share your thoughts in the comments. I carried Orion out of the park under the stares of neighbors filled with curiosity and fear. My heart felt heavy as stone, aching from holding his trembling body in my arms, and burning with rage over Priscilla Harroway's cruelty. I took him straight to the nearest veterinary. On the way there, I could feel each warm breath from his mouth, still tainted with the sting of the mace. I held him tighter, afraid that if I loosened my grip, I might lose this loyal friend for good. When I walked into the clinic, the veterinarian took one look at Orion and immediately led me into a small emergency room. "A service dog? What happened?" she asked. I didn't answer, just pointed at his eyes, where tears kept welling and falling. She laid him gently on the table, rinsed his eyes with a special solution, and then administered pain relief. I stood beside him, eyes fixed on every movement she made. "Lucky," the vet sighed. "Severe irritation, but no permanent damage. He'll need rest and medication for a few days. I'll prepare a full report photo. Test result. You should keep everything. You might need it." Hearing those words made my blood boil. Priscilla thought she could wield neighborhood authority to define right and wrong, but she had just crossed into territory protected by federal law built on the sweat and blood of millions of disabled individuals. I nodded, thanked the vet, and carefully placed every document into the folder. Those papers, those numbers and ink marks, were not just medical records, they were weapons. That night, with Orion lying beside me on the floor, his eyes calmer thanks to the medication, I opened my laptop. The cold blue light reflected off my face, highlighting every tense line on my forehead. I typed in ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and read through the statute, line by line. Each sentence felt like a blade pressed into the raw wound in my chest. The law was clear. Any assault, harassment, or interference with a service dog on duty constitutes a serious violation, punishable not only at the state level but also under federal jurisdiction. I read that section again and again, each word reaffirming that justice was on my side. Years in the military had taught me to live by command, to respect the weight of discipline. Now, I saw another kind of discipline, another kind of power, the power of the law, and that made me calmer, more certain. I opened my filing cabinet and pulled out a small note where I kept phone numbers of old friends. Some had passed, others had drifted away, but there was one name I knew was still there. Ethan Caldwell, a federal attorney who once fought beside me through the worst days in the Middle East. He used to say, "When I come back, I won't carry a rifle. I'll carry the law to protect those without a voice." I dialed the number. On the other end, Ethan's voice was low and familiar, carried the weight of someone who had long been hardened by brutal cases. I gave a concise account, leaving out nothing from Priscilla blocking the path, to the insult, to the act of spraying mace into Orion's face. I heard a long exhale through the line. "You're still facing the same kind of enemy, just in a different uniform," Ethan said. "Send me everything you've got. Video, statement, medical record. This is a case she won't walk away from." I sent all the files over email. Just a few minutes later, Ethan replied, "Good. The evidence is solid. Let me handle the prosecutor's office. You just need to be ready, because they won't sit quietly. Someone like her will fight back. She'll twist the truth any way she can." I looked over at Orion. He was sound asleep, his breathing steady. I gently stroked his head and whispered, "We won't be alone." In that moment, I no longer felt like an outcast being pushed out of this community. I was a soldier again, but this time, my weapon was the law, and the battlefield was the playground. Priscilla thought she ruled. I began documenting everything, line by line, like writing a combat report. Date, time, location, words spoken, actions taken, witnesses present. I left nothing out, because I knew every sentence could become a bullet aimed straight at the fake wall of power Priscilla had built. I remembered the look in her eyes when she shrugged and said, "Crime? I defined crime here." That exact phrase would come back to consume her. As night deepened, I sat in silence in the living room, in front of a stack of papers, thin but sharper than any blade. I took a sip of water, my eyes fixed on the words of the ADA statute. I pictured her being summoned, questioned, forced to sit and listen to the very laws she once believed could never touch her pristine neighborhood. I could see that scene clearly, and a fire rose in me that wouldn't die out. This wouldn't be over in a day or two. I knew Priscilla would. She was used to unchecked power in the HOA, used to people staying silent to avoid trouble, but I wasn't like that. I was used to staring down the barrel of a gun, and still moving forward. Threats were nothing compared to what I'd already faced. I told myself, the fight has only just begun. From that point on, a plan began to form in my mind. Every time I took Orion for a walk, I paid close attention to the eyes around us, memorizing the faces of those who had witnessed what happened. I spoke softly to a few people, subtly prompting them to admit that they, too, had seen and heard. Some avoided the conversation, but a few nodded, their eyes heavy with the weight of knowing. They were afraid, but they knew the truth. And one day, when this case was brought into the light, they would have to choose, continue their silence, or stand as witnesses. Orion recovered faster than I expected. Within just a few days, his eyes were bright again, his steps steady. He had not lost the calm that defined him. Watching him, I understood more deeply. If a dog could be this resilient, then I had no reason to retreat. In my mind, a tactical map slowly came into form. Every move Priscilla made would be tracked, every pattern exposed. I no longer saw her as a woman in a bright suit, but as a target, an enemy who needed to be removed from power. And this time, I would not be alone, because the law was standing behind me. That night, before turning off the light, I looked at Orion and whispered, "Sleep well, my friend. Tomorrow, we step into an open battle, but this time, we won't lose." My heart was set, and there was no turning back. I knew, from the moment she raised that canister to Orion's face, there would be no retreat. I would see this through, and Priscilla Harroway would learn that when you disregard the law and human dignity, the price you pay will never come cheap. News of Priscilla spraying mace at Orion spread quickly through the neighborhood. Short, secretly recorded videos were being passed around, and a few screenshots of text messages buzzed through private groups. I knew she wouldn't stay quiet. Someone so used to holding power would never let her reputation take a hit without fighting back. And just as I expect, only a few days later, the HOA announced an emergency meeting. The hall was right in the center of the neighborhood, a small building polished to a shine as if it were the seat of authority. I arrived with Orion, and all eyes followed us with weight. Some glances avoided mine, others were sharp with scrutiny, and a few subtle nods seemed to offer quiet encouragement. I understood that most residents here were accustomed to living in fear they wouldn't risk openly supporting me. Inside the hall, chairs were lined up in neat rows. Priscilla was already on the podium, microphone in hand, posture confident and arrogant. Her light-colored suit made her stand out like a self-appointed judge. As I entered, her gaze locked onto me instantly, and her lips curled not into a smile, but into a blade aimed at her opponent. He brings in filthy dogs that devalue the neighborhood. Her voice rang out across the room, her finger pointed straight at me like she was naming a criminal. The air thickened, a few whispers stirred, but most of the room remained silent. She knew how to control a crowd, how to plant fear of consequence. I stood still, not reacting yet. In my mind, every word she said was being recorded, living proof of her arrogance and abuse of power. I lifted my head, meeting her gaze without flinching. Orion sat beside me, calm and steady, as if he understood that today was another kind of battle. Priscilla continued, her voice rising with each sentence. I've received numerous complaints. People here paid good money to live in an elite community, a place that's clean, safe, and now we have someone parading a dog like this around, tarnishing the image of our neighborhood. I heard a man mutter behind me, it's a service dog, but he was quickly tugged at the sleeve by the person next to him. Silence returned, heavier than before. Then Priscilla lowered her voice, but each word hit like a slap across the face. People, of different colors, don't belong in a refined community like this. The entire room jolted. A few gasps slipped out, heads turned to look at me, but most stayed silent, as if those words had long become familiar. I saw a young woman press her lips together, her hands clenched tightly, but she didn't dare speak. The blood in my veins boiled. I thought of all the years I spent fighting, of the comrades of every skin color who stood shoulder to shoulder, of the flags draped over coffins that made no distinction about who lay beneath. And now, in a place that was supposed to be peaceful, I was being forced to hear this insult public and raw. I took a step forward, my voice low and steady. Do you think you're a queen? Even a queen doesn't stand above the law. The sound through the thick air. I saw a few glimmers of sympathy in the room, though still hesitant. An old man in the corner nodded slowly, his eyes clouded with age, but behind them was quiet support. A young boy next to his mother whispered, "Mom, that's a helper dog. I saw it on television." The mother quickly hushed him, but her eyes betrayed her discomfort with what she'd just heard. The room went silent for a few dragging seconds. Priscilla and I faced each other like opponents, in a match where neither wanted to be the first to blink. She tried to hold her smile, but the corner of her lips twitched just enough to reveal the crack in her controlled rage. "You'll regret going against me," she said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear, but the microphone was still on, and the entire room heard her threat. Her words echoed, leaving a heavy trail behind. I didn't respond. I knew I had already accomplished what I came for, exposing her true face to the neighborhood that once saw her as a symbol of authority. I looked around and saw the uncertainty on their faces. They weren't ready to stand up yet. Cracks were forming in the wall of silence. Orion sat beside me, his eyes locked upward, as if waiting for the next command. I placed a hand on his head, feeling calmer than ever. I had taken a critical step in this, and I knew Priscilla wouldn't stop. She would dig deeper, rally the entire HOA machine to discredit me. But I was no stranger to battlefield, and I understood once an enemy reveals their path to defeat is only a matter of time. That meeting ended in tense silence. No one laughed, no one chatted. People filed out quietly, but I caught their glances toward me and Orion. Some held fear, others a flicker of respect. I knew the seeds of resistance had been planted, and sooner or later, they would grow. And as I stepped out of that hall, I was filled with one clear feeling. This was no longer just my This was a fight for everyone who had ever been insulted, dismissed, or pushed aside for their skin color, their differences, or the arbitrary rules used to protect the few. And I swore I would see it through to the end. That afternoon, the sky was a deep, endless blue without a single cloud, as if nature were trying to stage the perfect for something about to happen. Sunlight stretched across every rooftop in the neighborhood, glinting off spotless windows and reflecting on the lake's surface until the water shone like a sheet of silver glass. From a distance, the sounds of children playing and leaves rustling in the wind painted a scene so peaceful it felt almost artificial. The air seemed calm and light, but inside me was a tension so sharp it squeezed the breath from my chest. It wasn't the thrill of someone anticipating victory, but the wary readiness of a man who had survived too many battles to believe anything ever ends simply. I knew this day would come, the day justice showed up, the day all the quiet effort I had poured in would finally be answered. I just didn't know how it would unfold, or if it would be enough to erase what Orion and I had endured. Orion walked beside me as I opened the door and led him out to the yard. His pale golden coat shimmered under the afternoon sun, and his steady gait resembled that of an old soldier, trained to observe and always ready. His ears stood tall, every step deliberate and full of purpose. Looking at Orion, I felt as if he, too, understood the weight of this, not just any day, but a decisive moment. Everything I had done, the emails sent, the reports written, the long phone calls, explaining the truth, the testimonies about abuse of power, discrimination, and finally the assault on Orion had reached the hands of those who held authority. All that was left now was to wait for the outcome. From the road leading into the neighborhood, I heard Priscilla's shrill laugh. It rang out like chalk, screeching across a board, sharp and grating. As I drew closer, I saw her standing in the front yard of a wealthy resident, the kind of person she often clung to in order to maintain her status within the community. With a glass of red wine in hand, she was holding court, her voice rising clearly like she was giving a speech to a room full of loyal followers. Her light-colored suit, impeccably tailored, hugged her frame and caught the evening light in a way that felt more blinding than elegant. Her face, despite the controlled expression, still carried that familiar air of arrogance, the face of someone too used to being feared, never challenged. I caught bits of her story, as she recounted the recent HOA meeting with smug satisfaction, boasting about how she had put in place an outsider who dared to bring a filthy dog into their luxury neighborhood. The laughter that followed was scattered and forced. It wasn't the laughter of agreement, it was the nervous reflex of people who had been warned before, still too afraid to step out from under her shadow of power. I didn't walk any closer. I stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, keeping Orion seated beside me, and waited. Orion looked up at me, then toward Priscilla, as if sensing the tension in the air and the shift that was about to come. And then, from the far end of the street, a sleek black federal vehicle appeared. Sunlight bounced off the hood, making it look like a block of burning steel rolling toward justice. Two officers stepped out, uniforms crisp, demeanor serious, every stride sharp and unhesitating. I wasn't the only one who saw them. Neighbors scattered around began to take notice some cracked open windows. Others pretended to water plant, but kept their eyes fixed on the road. "Priscilla Harroway," one of the officers said, voice clear and steady, "you are under arrest for assaulting a service dog, a federal offense." Each word landed like a hammer blow in the air, deliberate and undeniable. The wine glass in Priscilla's hand nearly slipped. She froze, as if struck square in the chest. Her face, always so carefully composed, full of self-assurance, turned pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. She stood there in her expensive suit, bathed in stunning afternoon light, but completely alone. None of her affluent companions stepped in to help. They stayed rooted in place, wide-eyed, some even turning away to hide quiet smile. The atmosphere she had ruled through artificial power collapsed in an instant. "I was just maintaining standards," she stammered, her once commanding voice now trembling, like someone drowning, reaching for the last float of authority. But no excuse mattered anymore. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was sharp and final, not a physical blow, but the most devastating strike to the dignity of someone who lived off image and control. The silence held for a few long seconds. Then came the whispers. It was about time. An elderly woman near the fence exhaled. "She's reaping what she sowed." A middle-aged man muttered, "She fined me once for letting my grass grow too high. I feel lighter already." The words were quiet but heavy, proved that not everyone forgot, only that they had once been afraid. And when fear fades, justice finds room to step in. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction. I simply placed my hand on Orion's back, the loyal dog who had been insulted, pushed aside from a place he should have been welcome. He remained seated, eyes bright, ears alert, like a soldier standing watch at the edge of a won battle. His calm steadiness brought a lightness to my chest. The car carrying Priscilla drove off, trailed by eyes that watched, measured, and finally exhaled. This fight wasn't over, but at least one chapter had closed the right way. That night, I sat inside the house. Orion was curled up at the foot of the chair, breathing steadily. The computer screen displayed a news ticker. HOA president arrested for assaulting service dog, federal violation. Beneath it was a photo of her in handcuffs, eyes vacant, face visibly unraveling. I didn't smile. I simply closed my eyes. For the first time in a very long while, I felt a moment of true peace. News of Priscilla Harroway's arrest spread faster than any wildfire. Within a single night, local broadcasts and even major news outlets were running the same headline. HOA president arrested for assaulting service dog. Images of her being escorted away, hands locked in metal cuffs, face blank with shock, played on a loop. For residents who were used to seeing Priscilla striding confidently through the neighborhood, always in her immaculate light-colored suits, always radiating authority, the moment landed like an unexpected blow. I sat in front of the screen, Orion curled up beside me, his eyes half closed. A few days of full recovery. On the screen, the anchor's voice rang out clearly. According to preliminary investigation, assaulting a service dog is considered a federal offense, which may result in imprisonment. The words echoed cold. I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, as I walked Orion through the neighborhood, the atmosphere had shifted. People looked at me differently, not just with hesitation or silence, but with uncertainty, even sympathy. A few people stopped, managing the first words they'd never dared say before. We saw the video. It was awful. I nodded, saying little, because I understood they were beginning to reclaim their voices. Within days, stories began to surface. A silver-haired man stood among a group of neighbors, voice trembling but full of buried resentment. Last year, I was fined over $500 just for planting the wrong flowers in my front yard. She said it violated regulation, but my neighbor planted the same one and wasn't fined at all. He paused, bit his lip, then added, I had to sell my house to pay the debt. Turns out the buyer was a real estate, and Priscilla was behind it. A middle-aged woman, her voice tight with emotion, said, My son was banned from using the pool. She said he was too loud. He's 12. Meanwhile, her grandkids threw loud parties all day, and no one said a word. The crowd around her fell silent, then slowly nodded. Everyone seemed to have lived through something similar. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together into a dark. Priscilla hadn't just abused her authority with fines. She had weaponized the HOA to force residents into submission, profit off their helplessness. The unjust penalties, the forced evictions, the shady property transfers, they all traced back to her. A young man who had moved in just a few years earlier shared at a community meeting. When I first arrived, she smiled and talked about community standards. 3 months in, I got 4 citations in a row for tall grass, for putting the trash can in the wrong place. I pushed back, but then my house was suddenly listed for sale if I had already given up. Turns out, she'd lined up a buyer in advance. He let out a bitter laugh, eyes burning with anger. Each story that was shared felt like another through the image Priscilla had built for herself. The false respect turned into outrage. People whispered to each other, then said it out loud. Turns out we've all been deceived. That sentence echoed again and again, from the mouths of the elderly to the young, from those she had bullied to those who had stayed silent. I sat quietly in a small gathering of residents, listening to their story. An elderly woman, her hands trembling, tears from her cheek, her voice frail. My husband died after we were forced out of our home. She fined us for hanging a tattered flag on our porch, said it ruined the neighborhood's image. I begged. Flag was my husband's keepsake, but she still forced us out. The room went completely still, broken only by her quiet sob. Orion lay pressed against my his head resting on my leg, as if he understood that the pain of these people was part of why I had to keep fighting. I placed my hand on his head, more certain than ever. This was no longer a personal conflict between me and Priscilla. It was a fight for an entire community that had been under pressure for far too long. The press kept digging. Journalists uncovered shell companies and shady transactions under the names of Priscilla's relative. Every time a home was sold at a loss, it was almost immediately bought by one of these companies, then for a much higher price. The wheel of profit kept spinning, all hidden beneath the label of preserving neighborhood value. One reporter said on air, no one ever imagined a HOA could become a personal money-making machine, but what's happening in Lakeshore Heights is proving otherwise. The comment hit hard because HOAs had long been viewed as symbols of order and discipline. Now, with everything exposed, it looked more like a mask worn by a woman hiding greed and discrimination. During those days, I received countless phone calls. People who once avoided me now whispered. Some sent me copies of their fine, along with messages like, here's evidence, use it. I didn't refuse. I gathered everything and passed it to Ethan Caldwell, the attorney friend handling the case directly. He replied, you're sitting on a mountain of evidence. Her ending is just a matter of time. That evening, I sat on the porch, Orion lying close by, his head resting on my leg. The street lamp cast a soft yellow glow. A few cars passed, fading into the distance with a hum. I thought about everything I had heard and seen. The feeling was a mix of anger and sorrow. Anger at a woman who had turned an entire community into a game of power. Sorrow for families who had paid the price. The lives crushed, so she could own one more house, one more slice of profit. I remembered the moment Priscilla raised her chin and said, here, I am the law. That sentence now sounded like a cruel joke. Because the real law had surfaced, the law of humanity, the law of justice, and it was preparing to the false throne she had built over so many years. In the days that followed, spontaneous gatherings began to form. Residents spoke more freely, no longer hesitant. They talked about fear, about humiliation, about the unfair money they had paid. And through all those stories, one common truth emerged. Priscilla's tyranny hadn't been accidental. It was systematic, deliberate, calculated. I saw the change in their eyes. From silence, they began to whisper. From whispering, they began to speak openly. And from speaking openly, they began to demand justice. It was as if this entire neighborhood had been kept in the dark for too long, and now, with just one crack of light, everything was pouring out. When I walked down the street with Orion, someone came up, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said quietly, thank you. Without you, probably would have stayed bowed forever. I nodded and replied, it's not me. It's justice. And now it's time we all stand tall together. Oh, inside me, the resolve grew stronger. The fight wasn't over, but the truth had surfaced, and once the truth is seen, it can never be buried again. I had long been used to taking notes, gathering small pieces of information, fitting them together into a complete picture. In the military, that habit helped me survive. Now, in a neighborhood that looked peaceful on the surface but was steeped in deception, that same skill was being used in a different way. I began digging deep, not just relying on scattered accounts from residents, but looking into old records. One evening, while Orion slept beside my desk, I searched through the public property data for the area. I remembered an elderly man telling me his house had been forced into sale after a string of absurd fines, and how the property had immediately ended up in the hands of a mysterious real estate company. I traced the company's name, only to realize it wasn't unfamiliar at all. The listed owner was a longtime close friend of Priscilla. The more I searched, the more connections I uncovered. One file stood out more than the rest, holding my attention longer than I expected. A case from 6 years ago. A multi-generational black family living in the neighborhood had been pressured into selling their home. The HOA's official reasoning listed multiple community violations, with a string of minor infractions: trash cans out of position, fence paint not matching the official color guide, and children's bicycles left on the lawn. It all sounded absurd, but bundled together and stacked with growing fines, pushed the family to a breaking point. I found the sale agreement. The home was sold for 3/4 of its market value, and the buyer? A company managed by Priscilla's brother-in-law. A few months later, the same property was sold again, this time for nearly twice the price. That family disappeared from the community, and over time, their name was forgotten. I sat there for a long time, eyes still fixed on the screen. The anger inside me was no longer just personal. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a system Priscilla had manipulated skillfully, using the HOA seat to pressure people, to exploit existing biases about race and class. I forwarded the entire file to Ethan Caldwell. Just days later, the press picked up the story. On the front page of a major paper, the headline struck hard. OA president forced black family to sell home, exploited system for profit. The community was shaken. Those who had once doubted or defended her now had no ground left to stand on. Conversations at doorsteps, in grocery stores, at the post office, all revolved around the same realization. She wasn't just cruel, she was blatantly racist. As I walked past the park, I heard two women whispering. I used to think she was just too strict, but now it's different. This is clear-cut discrimination, no attempt to hide it. The other nodded, her voice shaky. Come to think of it, I got fined once just because my friends took too long. Meanwhile, the wealthy throw parties non-stop. It's a total double standard. That news added fuel to the fire already ignited by the attack on Orion. Residents began gathering, organizing. Those who once stayed silent now stepped forward with more story. It turned out Priscilla had repeatedly targeted families of color, or those not part of the wealthy. She used fines to back them into corners, then indirectly forced them to sell their home. One afternoon, residents assembled at the community hall this time, not under HOA control. I stepped up to the podium and looked across the room. Their eyes were bright with anger, but also with anticipation. I knew I had to say what everyone was already thinking. We've been silent for too long, I began, my voice carrying across the stillness. And that silence is exactly what she's counted on. One by one, we've been pushed to the edge, forced to pay absurd penalties, disrespected for the color of our skin or the size of our bank account. We let it continue by bowing our head, by believing we were isolated victims. But now, the truth has surfaced. This is no longer a personal it's a fight for the entire community. I saw tense faces shift into resolve. A young man raised his hand. I'm willing to testify. My family was threatened with legal action just for letting our kid play in the yard. A middle-aged woman added, I've still got my old fine notices. I'll give them to the lawyer. It's time she saw we're not afraid anymore. The room erupted. Cries of, enough, rang out together, strong and unfiltered, no longer whispered. The shout thundered like a storm, vibrating through every wall. I knew this was the moment when years of suppression finally broke open. Orion sat beside me, head lifted, ears standing tall. He didn't understand the words, but he sensed the shift in the air. I leaned down, placed a hand on his head. We've lit the fire now, I whispered, and this fire will burn her false throne to the ground. As I stepped down from the podium, dozens of hands reached out to shake mine. They no longer looked at me as a troublemaker, but as someone who had sparked resistance. But I knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and full of storms. Priscilla Harroway was not the type to let go easily. She would fight back. She would claw at what remained. But the truth had risen, and once revealed, it could never be buried again. The community had spoken, and when a collective voice rises, false power crumbles. I believed that with absolute certainty. The court date arrived sooner than many expected. The case sent shockwaves not only through Lakeshore Heights, but also into neighboring communities. Journalists crowded the entry, camera flashes popping non-stop. When I entered with Orion, lenses turned directly toward us. As if to capture the moment, key witness stepped into the spotlight. Orion remained calm, his eyes bright and composed, presence a quiet reminder that this wasn't just a minor dispute, but a federal case. Priscilla Harroway appeared minutes later. She no longer carried her usual confidence. Her face was pale, and no amount of heavy makeup could hide her exhaustion. The same light-colored suit still clung to her body, but now it was stripped of authority, making her seem out of place in the solemn air of the courtroom. She tried to keep her back straight, but her eyes darted nervously, searching for support that never came. No one returned her glance. The trial began. The prosecutor stood, his voice firm and measured. Today, we're not just trying an individual act, we're trying to abuse power, show contempt for the law, and discriminate, which has harmed an entire community. The defendant, Priscilla Harroway, president of the Lakeshore Heights HOA, attacked a federally protected service dog, Orion, and used her position to coerce residents into selling their homes for personal gain. Priscilla sprang to her voice trembling. I only wanted to preserve the neighborhood's value, to keep this place clean and refined. The words strained for sympathy, but rang bitter in the courtroom's silence. The prosecutor didn't flinch. He signaled to the technician. The large screen at the front lit up. The video played. Priscilla reaching into her bag, pulling out the pepper spray, and attacking Orion. My voice echoed in the chamber. You just committed a federal crime. The room fell still. The only sound was the video. The footage showed Orion recoiling, tears streaming from his reddened eyes, and me cradling him in my arm. It drew clenched fists, shaking head. When the video ended, the room remained frozen until the prosecutor turned to the judge and said, "This is indisputable evidence." Witnesses took the stand. The woman who recorded the video spoke with a shaking voice but unwavering tone. I saw it with my own eyes. No one told me to record, but I knew the truth had to come out. Another man testified he was heavily fined for planting the wrong flower, while wealthier neighbors were never cited. An elderly woman broke down, recalling the day she was forced to remove the commemorative flag of her late husband. Each testimony deeper into the math Priscilla tried to preserve. Then I was called. I recounted everything from the first time I saw her condescending stare, to that morning in the park, to the moment the pepper spray nearly caused permanent damage to Orion. I didn't yell. I didn't embellish. I let the truth speak for itself. When I stepped down, Orion was still sitting there, eyes alert, ears standing tall, a living testament to everything I had just said. Priscilla tried to cry, her sobs echoing through the courtroom. I didn't mean to. I only wanted to protect our standard. I've dedicated my whole life to this community. She wiped her tears, her voice trembling, but no one in the room believed the performance anymore. The judge sat high above, his face impassive. He listened, unmoved by emotion. When all witnesses had finished, he leaned forward, his sharp gaze fixed on Priscilla. Mrs. Harroway, federal law is not a joke. Attacking a service dog is a direct assault on the rights of the disabled. The evidence is conclusive, the witnesses unanimous. You have committed a federal offense. Sentence: incarceration. The final words landed with force, like a blade striking down. The room fell silent for a few seconds, then murmurs broke out. She deserves it. I looked around, and saw faces that once held fear now lit with relief. They were no longer afraid of Priscilla, no longer bowed beneath the shadow she had cast. Priscilla collapsed, her eyes vacant. The steel cuffs clicked shut once more, not in the middle of the neighborhood, but here in court, before the eyes of the entire community. She screamed, her voice cracked and desperate. You'll all regret this. But the words rang hollow, swallowed by the crowd's indifference. I looked at Orion and placed a hand on his. He looked up at me, his clear eyes seeming to say that everything had fallen into place. I took a deep breath, taking in the scent of worn wood from the benches, the rustle of, and the low murmurs of the gathered residents. This was not just a sentence for a tyrannical woman. It was a turning point, proof that a community had found its voice again, that the law could reach anyone, no matter how untouchable they once believed themselves to be. As I left the courtroom, I heard someone behind me whisper, "Now we can start over." I didn't turn around, but I knew that voice spoke for all of us. If you were the judge, would you hand down a harsher sentence? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As the trial came to a close, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted noticeably, as if a great wind had swept through and cleared away the thick dust that had long clung to every roof, every brick-paved path, every white picket fence, those seemingly innocent dividers that had once marked an invisible boundary between people. The residents who stepped out of the courtroom no longer walked with downcast eyes or hesitant steps, but with deep, liberating sighs, lighter strides, and gazes forward. For the first time in years of quiet submission, I saw my neighbors holding their heads high, no longer stealing glances, as warning notices were pinned to front doors, no longer avoiding each other's eyes out of fear of being called out in one of the HOA's heavy-handed meetings. Something inside them had been released. Not just the chains of false regulations, but the heavy shadow cast by Priscilla Harroway, the woman who once believed she was the irreplaceable symbol of this neighborhood. Orion became the center of that homecoming. He didn't understand everything that had happened, but with his gleaming coat, gentle eyes, and steady posture, he naturally became a living emblem of the community's rebirth. People gathered around him, as if finding in him him a part of themselves, a silent redemption, or simply a quiet gratitude. Hands reached out to stroke him soft, and smiles bloomed on faces once frozen by fear. An elderly woman stepped forward, bent down to touch Orion's head, her eyes brimming. "Thank you, sweet boy. You helped us believe again." A child once banned from the public pool wrapped his arms around Orion like greeting an old friend, laughing openly with the joy of rediscovering a piece of his stolen childhood. I stood off to the side, not pushing through the crowd, simply observing in silence. What I felt wasn't pride or triumph, but a deep, quiet relief, kind that settles when you know the struggle was not in vain. Every moment I held my tongue to avoid escalating conflict. Every time I swallowed my anger instead of letting it explode. Every instance I chose patience over retaliation had led to this out, and it was worth it not just for me, but for all those who had been dismissed, mistreated, or bullied by a system built on fear and the habit of silence. As the crowd began to thin, a few neighbors came over. They didn't need to say much. A look, a nod, a light touch on the shoulder, each one enough to let me know they understood and appreciated what had been done. A frail old man placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice raspy, firm as it through the sunlit stillness. The scary part wasn't that a dog, Pepper, sprayed, but that someone was given power to do something so inhumane. I repeated the word, a little louder this time, so those nearby could hear them, so they would echo like a warning, because this wasn't just a reckoning with the past, it was a principle to carry forward into the future. As the trial concluded, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed unmistakably, as if a powerful wind had swept through and blown away the thick haze that had clung stubbornly to every roof, every brick walkway, every white picket fence that once seemed inanimate but had served as invisible lines dividing one person from another. The residents who stepped out of the courtroom no longer walked with lowered heads and timid step, but with deep, relieving sighs, lighter and eyes set forward. For the first time in years of quiet repression, I saw my neighbors holding their heads high, no longer sneaking glances when a notice was taped at the front door, no longer avoiding each other's eyes, out of fear of being singled out at one of the HOA's oppressive meetings. Something had been unlocked inside them, not just the chains of counterfeit rules, but the heavy shadow named Priscilla Harroway, the woman who once believed she was the irreplaceable symbol of this neighborhood. Orion became the focal point of that return. He didn't fully grasp what had just occurred, but with his glossy coat, gentle eyes, and composed demeanor, he naturally became a living emblem of this community's rebirth. People gathered around him, as though they saw in him a part of themselves, an invisible redemption, or simply a gesture of gratitude. Hands reached out to gently stroke, smiles unfolded on faces once rigid with fear. An elderly woman approached, knelt, and touched Orion's head, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you, sweet boy. You helped us find our faith again." A child who had once been banned from the community pool wrapped his arms around Orion, like embracing an old friend, laughing uncontrollably with a joy too honest to hide, as if reclaiming a part of a childhood once stolen. I stood in the back, not pushing into the crowd, only watching quietly. What I felt wasn't pride or satisfaction, but a profound kind of relief. Relief in knowing that this long and difficult journey had not been in vain. Every time I held back, every word I swallowed to keep from escalating, every ounce of rage I forced down instead of unleashing, had now led to something just, not only for me, but for all those who had been dismissed, down upon, or bullied by a system powered by fear and the habit of silence. As the crowd began to disperse, a few neighbors, they didn't need to say much. A look, a nod, a hand on the shoulder, those were enough for me to know they understood and valued what I had done. A frail old man laid a hand on my shoulder, his voice rough but resolute as it through the sunlit stillness. What's frightening isn't the dog getting pepper sprayed, but the fact that someone was given power to do something so inhumane. I repeated his word, slightly louder, so those nearby could hear, letting them echo like a warning, because it wasn't just a story from the past, a principle that needed to be etched into the future. I saw the shift in the eyes around me, where once they had been dulled by the habit of endurance, by a vague, formless fear, now they shone with clarity. These were the eyes of people who had just stepped out from what once seemed to be the permanent shadow of Priscilla Harroway, a shadow she had so carefully constructed through rules, threats, and HOA meetings that resembled closed-door tribunals more than community gathering. Now, that shadow had lifted. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt the weight in the air ease, like a city just passed through a heavy storm. I walked Orion down the streets that had once carried the constant feeling of being watched. But today, people didn't just greet me, they greeted Orion, too. A few families opened their gate, invited me in. Someone offered a glass of cold water. Someone else brought out for Orion, and others asked me to stay and talk. Conversations spilled out from porches and patio tables, not whispered complaints behind kitchen doors, but open discussions about reshaping the neighborhood's future. Everyone had something to say, something to contribute. They talked about holding new elections for the board, about making sure no one like Priscilla could ever sit above them again without being held accountable. When night fell, I sat on the porch, Orion resting his head on my leg, breathing steadily. The moon stretched its light across the lake, silver pooling over roof and shimmering on the water's surface, making the scene look like a painting. The cool night breeze slipped into my sleeve, brushed through my hair like it was trying to whisper something. I looked out across the lake, thinking of the road we had taken, of that first morning when Priscilla stopped me with that condescending stare, of the day Orion was pepper sprayed, simply for being the embodiment of something she couldn't accept, of that HOA meeting where I was paraded like a fool. Every one of those moments felt like a slash, not on the body, but on dignity, on patience. And yet, those cuts had awakened the most important thing: awareness. The lesson had become clear. Power, left unchecked, becomes a weapon in the hands of the wrong person. A seat like HOA president, meant to uphold order and serve collective good, had been twisted into a self-appointed throne, where one autocrat could wield their will as if it were law. But no throne is eternal when faced with truth. The law, even if slow, burns like a hidden ember waiting only for the right wind to rise into flame, and once it ignites, it leaves no room for arrogance to hide. I turned to Orion and whispered, "We did it." He lifted his head, eyes shining in the moonlight as if he understood every word. To me, Orion wasn't just a service dog. He was a comrade, a witness, a symbol of loyalty, and of the unwavering belief that justice still exists. The next day, the community gathered to elect a temporary board. The meeting was no longer filled with shouting, no longer tainted by fake smiles or veiled threat. People listened to one another. A young mother stood up and spoke about the need for a playground for the children. The whole room applauded. An old man raised a point about a fund for maintaining public amenities. Everyone took note. It was a simple picture, but more beautiful than anything Priscilla had ever preached about the excellence of the neighborhood. I sat in the back, said nothing, and just quietly observed. This was what I had hoped for all along: a community that speaks, listens, and stands up. On the way home, a few kids ran after Orion, calling his name like they were calling a beloved friend. They laughed, darting through sunlit paths. Watching them, a thought rose in me. Maybe they would grow up in a neighborhood that was truly just, where power wouldn't be used to intimidate, where differences wouldn't be punished. I told myself, this lesson wasn't only for Lakeshore Heights, it was for any place where power is used to crush those beneath it. Because silence is complicity, and sometimes, all it takes for everything to change is a single moment, the moment a gentle dog is harmed, jolting a whole community awake, making them realize the line has been crossed. I stepped into the house, Orion quietly following, his tail swaying gently. Inside me was a deep and lasting calm. The battle had ended, but its lesson would linger like a reminder no one should ever forget. Looking back on everything that happened in Lakeshore Heights, I saw clearly a journey that belonged not just to Orion and me, but to a community that had spent too many years with their heads bowed. From a morning that seemed ordinary, when I simply wanted to walk my service dog around the lake, to the moment Priscilla Harroway revealed her true nature through a cruel act, and then through the long days of legal and moral struggle that followed, it all wove into a story no one in this neighborhood would ever forget. What haunts me most is not just the moment Orion was attacked, but how the community reacted. The heavy silence, the sideways glances, the phones raised to record, but lips sealed shut, each one a sign of fear that had taken root. They had grown used to living in the shadow, Priscilla cast, used to treating her as the one who set the standard. But in that very moment, when the video spread, and the law stepped in, I realized silence was never the end. It was only the pause before the right moment to finally speak. After the public arrest, the truth surfaced layer by layer. Residents who once seemed uninvolved began to recall past incidents, finally brave enough to speak the words that had once choked in their throat. Families lost their homes over petty infractions. Children were barred from playing simply because they weren't part of the favored group, and people were publicly humiliated because of their skin color. All of it became a torrent of evidence, unstoppable. Priscilla once believed she was the law. Wealth and superficial power could turn everything into a game. But once the truth came to light, the throne she had built was nothing more than a sandcastle facing a rising tide. I remember the look in her eyes during the trial. When the prosecutor played the video, when the witnesses stood one after another to testify, every excuse became absurd. Tears didn't save her, and her defense about upholding standards only added weight to the sentence. And when the judge delivered the verdict, each word landed like the final hammer blow. I heard whispers ripple through the courtroom. She got what she deserved. That wasn't just a condemnation of one person, but a collective affirmation that the entire community had finally awakened. What mattered most after everything wasn't the sentence itself, but the shift in the hearts of those who remained. As I walked out of the courtroom, I saw people looking at each other differently. They started talking, started discussing how the neighborhood should be run, about electing leaders who were truly worthy. Fear was replaced by a desire to rebuild. The whole neighborhood felt as if it had been unlocked. Freed from the cramped room Priscilla had them in with fines and threats. Orion, the dog who had endured it all, became a symbol. Adults stroked his fur like drawing comfort, and children chased after him like a beloved companion. Watching it, I realized that sometimes great change begins with something small. A gentle dog mistreated sparked a moral reckoning, pulling an entire community out of paralysis. That's the power of truth. It lies dormant, but once awakened, it can shake an entire system to its core. From this story, the most powerful lesson is that silence protects no one forever. People may endure, may step for the sake of, but long-standing endurance only creates fertile ground for evil to thrive. Priscilla wasn't powerful because she was skilled, but because the community had stayed silent for too long. When one person finally stood up, the balance shifted instantly. I was merely the first voice, but the real strength came from the flood of stories that followed, from the collective will of an entire community. Another lesson is that power must be held accountable. Even an organization as small as an HOA, when turned into a tool for greed, can make victims of an entire neighborhood. Rules created with good intent, placed in the wrong hands, become chains. The only way to prevent that is through transparency, through a spirit of questioning, and through refusing to let anyone place themselves above the law. The story also reminded me of dignity. People can lose many things, but if they allow their dignity to be trampled and still choose to remain silent, that is the greatest loss of all. Orion couldn't speak, but in that moment of cruelty, his eyes said everything. He didn't lash out, he didn't retreat, he simply looked at me with unwavering loyalty. And that look made me realize that if I didn't speak up, didn't fight for him, it would mean I was willing to let my own dignity be. I believe every person in this community has lived through a moment of reckoning like that, of realizing that their dignity had also been dismissed. Only they had never dared to face it until now. Now that everything has come to a close, Lakeshore Heights has turned a new page. People are learning to listen to one another, to debate openly, instead of whispering behind closed doors. They talk about building a fairer community, about creating an environment where children can grow up with respect, where the elderly don't have to live in fear of losing their home. Meetings are no longer a stage for one dictator's monologue, but a space where everyone can speak as equal. Orion and I still walk around the lake every morning. The faces we pass are no longer guarded, they smile and say hello. Sometimes, a few people stop to talk about new plans for the neighborhood, and in their eyes, I see hope. That hope isn't just for me, it's for themselves. It's the belief that they now have a say in the destiny of their own community. What I've come to understand most is this: justice isn't some radiant beam of light descending from above. It's a flame each person must carry inside. When one flame is lit, it can ignite another, and another, until together they become a light strong enough to drive out the dark. I may have been the spark, but it's the community that fire burning. To me, this ending doesn't belong to Lakeshore Heights alone. It belongs to anyone who's ever been dismissed or made to believe they were powerless against the strong. Remember, truth carries more power than you and once you dare to rise, you'll find that others have been waiting for someone to lead the way. When Orion lifts his head and looks at me, his eyes glowing in the afternoon sun, I know deep down we didn't just survive a battle, we won something far greater. And the final lesson, Etched, is this: power can breed arrogance, but arrogance inevitably becomes its own grave. Dignity and justice, once protected, become a legacy for the next generation to show them that darkness never lasts forever.